Okay, good. So are we good? We'll start? Estamos listos? Okay, little did he know. So I should explain the title. So I was having a hard time actually coming up with some ideas for talks to do for here. Because I know a bunch of things, but I don't know what is going to interest you guys. So of course I had to do a talk on Spring Security, but then after that it's sort of a wide open thing. So this is actually kind of a collection of very small topics kind of glued together, so they have really nothing to do with each other. It's just a bunch of things that I think are interesting. And what was happening was, as I was discovering these things, some of these things I knew and I just haven't really maybe talked about them much, and some of the things I learned and was surprised to find out some of this stuff. And so this phrase of little did he know, or that would be interesting to know, or people would be interesting to find this out, kept kind of running through my head for a lot of these things. And there's this amazing movie, I hope you've seen it, and if you haven't, your homework is to watch this movie. So Will Ferrell is the main actor, and of course he's a comedian. I love his movies, but this is a drama role. There's some comedy in it, but it's just the most amazing movie. It doesn't much matter for the talk, but he works for the IRS, and he's a very boring guy. He's a mathematician kind of type, and I totally don't identify with him at all. But so he audits Maggie Gyllenhaal, and she's sort of a hippie baker type, and so she hates him at first because he's auditing her and hassling her about money. But then there's a sort of a love interest there, and it's a very complex movie. And what happens is he's a character in a novel. And he starts hearing the author who's writing the book narrating his life in his head. And so that's the premise, and it goes from there, and it's just the most amazing movie, and I've seen it several times, and I have to watch it alone because I get a little weepy, and I don't like people to see me like that. So, but there's this great phrase in it. So he hears her narrate, little did he know that this simple, seemingly innocuous act would result in his imminent death. So he's trying to figure out what's going on. Am I going crazy? What's happening here? So he finds Dustin Hoffman, who plays a local professor at a university, a literature professor, and he's trying to maybe get some help can you help me figure out what is going on in my head? And this phrase is kind of what tips the scale. It's kind of what makes them realize what's really happening. And he says, did you say little did he know? And he says, dear God, I've written papers on little did he know. I used to teach a class on little did he know. I once gave an entire seminar on little did he know. And it probably doesn't translate to Spanish all that well. It's kind of a very idiomatic English phrase. But it's, I just love that movie, and this whole scene, it was very funny. So that was the theme for the talk. So, all right, so again, lots of little topics. We'll have plenty of time, so if anything doesn't make sense, I'm going to make some statements that you may disagree with strongly, because I'm going to be very opinionated here. So if you have any questions, if you have any disagreements, please ask during the talk, and we can certainly have time at the end, but feel free to be rude. Pretend you're an American and just burst right on through. So we all know about the Groovy Map Constructor, right? It's not a Grails concept at all. It's a Groovy thing. We use it in Grails quite a lot, especially with domain classes, because with domain classes, except for the constraints block and the mapping block and the has many and that sort of stuff, a basic domain class is really just a pogo. You say class name, doesn't implement any interfaces or extend any base classes, and you say string name, date, last published, Boolean, whatever. You just declare these properties and they become automatically persistent. And then in Java, we tend to write a lot of constructors. And quite often you'll end up with, for a very complex class, you'll have, new person, pren, Bob, comma, Smith, comma, true, null, 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 42, null, 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 right? I mean, so we don't worry about that in Groovy because we use the map constructor and we just set whatever properties we need to set, and that's great. So, but show of hands, how many of you think you understand how the map constructor is actually implemented inside of Groovy? I know that guy does. I didn't know. I mean, and so I started digging into it, and it's actually very mechanical. There's not that much to it. It is not a real constructor. So backing up a little bit, with Grails, we do a tremendous amount of AST transformations during compilation. So if you decompile a Grails domain class, There are over 100 methods that are added to the domain class. Massive amounts of mixed in behavior. Same thing with controllers. Services, almost nothing. Services are very lightweight. They're not very Grailsy. We don't have a lot of behavior added to them. We wrap them in a transactional proxy by default, but other than that, I mean, that's not a Groovy thing, that's a Spring thing. So it isn't the case that there's actually a constructor that takes a map that's in the bytecode that you could use from Java. It's a purely dynamic thing. In fact, I was actually struggling a little bit recently because I'm trying to, in any project that I work on that uses Grails 2.2 or higher, which uses Groovy 2.0 or higher, I try to use compile static as much as possible because you get the better performance and you get a lot of more compile time checks, and it just makes a lot of sense. And anything that needs to be dynamic, of course, you leave it dynamic, but I try to use compile static. And I was trying to use a map constructor, and there was a map object that didn't have a type, and I was casting it, we were casting it to map, and it wasn't compiling in compile static. That was failing. But then if I use a literal map constructor, right? So if I say new person, pren, first name colon, whatever, second, last name colon, whatever, the map literal works. But if I say new person, pren, map, and I cast it to a map, that doesn't compile. And the reason is that there's special casing inside of the compile static code that, because that's dynamic behavior, there's a special case for in compile static where it actually coerces it and cheats a little bit. But if you explicitly cast it, then there's no handling for that. So it was kind of an edge case. Because it isn't a real constructor. If you decompile the class, it's not there. So what happens is it's actually in, depends on where you look, it's actually in metaclass impl, but there's we all know about call site caching and all that stuff. So there's really two locations where this happens. And all that it does, it's very mechanical. It just uses the empty constructor, because if you don't define any constructors in a Java or Groovy class, the compiler always adds the empty constructor for you, right? But if you add any constructors at all, then you don't get the empty constructor for free. So if you add a real constructor, a parameterized constructor, and you still want the empty constructor, you have to explicitly add that. And we'll get to that in a bit. So what it does is it depends on the fact that there's an empty constructor there. It calls that, instantiates a new empty class, and then it just loops through the key value pairs in the map, and it looks for properties, well, setters, based on the keys, and it calls set property, set property, set property. Not that fancy, it's pretty cool. But it relies on that no-arg constructor, either one that you created or one that was already there, implicitly there, because the constructor added, the compiler, Java-C or Groovy-C, adds that for you. So that's important. It's a little bit more complicated in Grails domain classes, though. And what I was doing, I've been doing a lot of work on finally trying to get the 2.0 version of the Spring Security core plugin released. And as I was doing some work, I was looking at the domain classes. You know, when you run the S2 quick start script, it generates a user class, a role class, and the join table class. And if you want it, it'll create the request map class. And that's if you use Gorm to go to the database to retrieve your username roles and that sort of thing. You don't have to do that. That's just the default behavior. And I was looking at those classes, and I saw a bunch of opportunities for adding in extra behavior, hash code and equals methods, and some other stuff. And I was thinking, because I do a lot of throwaway app, Spring Security app creation. When I'm testing stuff, I'll say Grails create app, delete me, and then I'll go to build config and I'll add in the dependency for the Spring Security core plugin. I'll get it going. I'll copy paste some stuff, and I'll fix a bug or do something, and I'll delete it. Right? I do that all the time. So I'm constantly creating a new user and a new role and save and all that stuff. And I should just put that in a file somewhere and copy paste it, but I usually type it a lot. So I was thinking it'd be nice if I could, instead of saying new user, username colon admin, password colon password, enabled colon true dot save, new role authority colon authority dot save, I should use real constructors. I mean, because usually I'm now defaulting the enabled behavior, the enabled property to true. So I can just create a user by setting the username and password. And it'd be a little tighter if I could just say new user pren admin comma password. Not a big deal, but I thought it'd be nice to add that. But things got weird between the map constructor and the things we do in Grails domain classes and all this stuff. So, so what happens is, you know that in domain classes, because they're an artifact, and all artifacts, so artifacts are controllers and services and domain classes and tag libs and all that stuff. Basically anything under Grails app. So artifacts support dependency injection by default, and you can dependency inject Spring Beans into domain classes. And I think the sort of the prototypical, the standard or use case for that, the reason you would do that is to inject in a service for validation. There's plenty of other reasons you might want to do that, but in my mind, I think that's the most common use case for it. And it works, but how does it work? Because when I go to a controller, there's magic involved in how the controller gets instantiated, right? You don't really, do you guys know how controllers, when I make a request into a Grails app, how the controller becomes active? It's really messy stuff, and we don't care because it just works. But if I wanted to inject in a service instance into a controller, I know, well, you probably know that services get auto-registered as a Spring Bean. But what you probably don't know is that controllers do too, and domain classes are also Spring Beans. Why would they be Spring Beans? They're not singletons, obviously, because domain classes would be the worst thing ever to have as singletons. But they're prototype beans, right? Singletons are the default scope for Spring Beans, but you can, there's many different scopes, and the two kind of most common ones are prototype scope, meaning every time you request the bean instance from the bean factory, the application context, you get a new instance of that bean with its dependencies set. So that's the trick that we use in Grails for domain classes. So the constructor is actually redefined in the domain classes to use the application context to get the instance from the application context. And that's kind of weird, because we're defining a constructor which doesn't return the thing that was created. It goes somewhere else and gets it and returns that. And you can actually, this is something weird in Groovy, you can actually return something from a constructor that isn't an instance of the class, which is very perverse. Please don't ever do that. But you can. So Graham, when Graham started using, it's like heroin for the guy. He started using a little bit of AST transformations, and then suddenly he was an AST junkie, and everything was ASTs everywhere. And so that AST transformation adds in a constructor, a special empty constructor, the no-arg constructor, that supports dependency injection. That's why that works. And although we could do something kind of interesting, if we had to create new non-persistent domain class instances, what are we going to do when Hibernate loads it? How's Hibernate, because when you call get or find by whatever or a list or whatever, Hibernate runs a query and it gets the data and it creates new instances, one or more instances, and then it sets the data and it gives it to you. So it would be really tricky, I think, for us to somehow have this groovy way, Grailsy way of getting a domain class for new instances, but then that supports dependency injection, but then for persistent instances, it doesn't. So it's all one behavior, and it uses the constructor. So Hibernate calls that constructor. It has no idea that there's any Spring involved or Grails involved or Groovy involved. It doesn't care anything about that stuff. It just needs to create a new instance of the class, set the properties, and go. So because it's an AST transformation, it's in the bytecode. Java can see it. It's not a dynamic metaclass thing. It's really there. So that's what happens. So if I have a domain class, single property, right? This is a classic domain class. It's not very fancy, but it's totally valid. What if I wanted to add in a constructor that's parameterized? Now, if this were a Java class, I would know that if I add a parameterized constructor, I have to remember to add in the empty constructor because it's no longer there. So here, because I didn't define any constructors, there is an empty constructor there. As soon as I do this, if it was a Java class or a Groovy class that's not a domain class, then I don't have an empty constructor, and I would have to create it. And remember that the map constructor depends on the existence of a no-arg empty constructor. And if it's not there, bad things happen. It doesn't fail to compile. It doesn't. It fails actually at runtime when you try to actually. And I have a little demo where I'm going to show you that. So I have to remember to put in the empty constructor, right? Nope. Turns out that because Grails adds in through the ST the empty constructor, it won't add it in if it's already there. So I'm actually defeating behavior because everything that's done in that empty constructor that the AST adds is now gone because it's going to see that there's already an empty constructor there. It won't overwrite it. That would be really rude. So it just doesn't add in anything, and so you lose behavior. And what you lose is dependency injection, and I'm lucky that I saw this because it would have been a very embarrassing bug to add. So the answer is, this is what you end up having to do when you do this. And that should look very weird because I'm calling, in any constructor you can call super and this, right? You can call other constructors. So this is normal stuff, except that there's no this there. There's no empty constructor. So why does this work? Why does this compile? Because there is a constructor there, we just can't see it. And we're all used to that with Grails and with Groovy, right? There's tons of stuff there. We just assume that it's there. We hope it's there. Because remember that there's 100+ methods in this class. There's a whole bunch of stuff there. Just can't see it because it's not in the source code. It's in the, it'll be eventually in the class file when it's compiled at compile time. So all of the new generated domain classes in the Spring Security plugin all use this pattern. So they have defined constructors, but because I happen to catch this, they also still have an empty constructor, they still have the map constructor, and it all works. So if you want to use the map constructor, that's great. If I want to use the parameterized constructor, that's awesome. We get to do our own thing, that's great. So basically, the biggest thing that you need to do you call this for is to make sure that dependency injection works. I need to do that in the generated classes because I don't know how you're going to use them, and I don't know what you're going to add to them, how you're going to change them around later on. In my own code, I wouldn't do this because I know whether or not I'm using dependency injection in this class, and if I'm not using it, I'm not going to bother with calling that other constructor. But let me do a really quick demo of that. So I've got my can you guys read that? All right, so it's a little bit more complicated than from the slides. So I did two things. Well, I got this demo code anyway. Let me get that out of the way. So I added in a dependency injection just for testing. Got the same property. I've got the empty constructor, but I commented out the this call. But then I have another constructor with a this call in it so we can see the behavior for both. So if I run a Groovy console, Grails console, we can see what's going on here. So while that starts up, let me jump ahead a little bit. Oh, I guess I won't. Okay, so okay. So I'm going to use a map constructor to see that it still works, print out the name that I set and the data source. Then I'm going to call the onearg parameterized constructor that doesn't call this, and I'm hoping that this is still set, but this is null. Then I'm going to call the toarg, which does call this, and this is going to be set, and this shouldn't be null. And then I'm going to call it using the empty constructor and see what happens. So I put in the print lines in there so that we could see what's going on. I'm going to just copy this into an editor so we can read it a little bit more easily. So what do we get? Using the map constructor, the name got set properly, and it prints out the data source. That's awesome. So if I'm using the map constructor, there's no this involved, so it works exactly the way you wanted it to. If I call my new parameterized constructor, but I forgot to call this, or I didn't know that to call this, the name gets set, but the dependency injection didn't work. It's null. Then I use the toarg. The number of arguments doesn't matter. I just needed two different constructors. When I do call this from a parameterized constructor, it does dependency injection. And then when I use the default constructor, of course, there's no name set, but the dependency injection works. So I thought that was kind of cool stuff. Okay. This is not a big deal. This is kind of petty, actually, but don't use newDate.getTime to get the time in milliseconds. We're not JavaScript developers. That's how we do it in JavaScript. Or you call it date.now, right? But this isn't a big deal, but it's just silly, right? You create a new date, and you get its time, and then you throw it away. That's a lightweight object. It's easily garbage collected. But why are we creating a whole date object just to get the current time in millis when that's a single method call? We don't have to create this superfluous object and throw it away. And not coincidentally, that's exactly where the date object got the value in the first place. So just skip the middleman and go direct. Not a big deal, but if I'm going to give you my laundry list of cool things and annoying things, then this had to be in the list. This is kind of a cool thing in Grails. So there's this, I don't think there's a name for this. But if we have a domain class, for example, a book, so an author has many books, right? So we have an author domain class somewhere, and I don't use has many belongs to, right? Because collections are bad in Grails. We all know about my talk from a million years ago that's still sadly valid. Have you seen that talk, the collection performance stuff? Collection performance in Grails is scarily bad, and you should never say never, but you should never use collections in Grails. Never use has many in Grails. Never. Never. And if you complain about the performance of your Grails app and you're using has many, then I'm going to tell you to shut the hell up, because it's your fault. Okay, so I've got an author class, and then I've got a many-to-one into the book class. So the book has a title, the date that it was published, and the author who wrote the book, right? It turns out that there is an author ID dynamic property. So whatever the name of if it was author A, then it would be AID. It's just the property name plus capital I and D. And by default, that object is lazily loaded. You can make it eagerly loaded if you want, but by default, collections and so many-to-ones and one-to-manys are lazily loaded by default. So if I did hate myself and I did use collections, I would say static on the author side. I would say static in author. I'd say has many books book, and that books collection is uninitialized until I access it, and then it initializes. So it's lazily populated. Same thing with the author. So if I load a book instance, the title and the date published will be populated, but the author will be null. But then as soon as I say maybe printline book.author.name, then it'll go to the database, retrieve the author instance, and get it. But what if I wanted to know the ID of the author for some other reason, as a foreign key? In order to load that instance, that ID has to be there somewhere. Something in Grails or Hibernate, and it turns out in Hibernate, that ID has to be stored there so that when I do access the author property, it can go to the database and retrieve it, because otherwise how is it going to know where that is? So the ID of the author is in there, in the mess somewhere, and that's exactly what author ID does. It retrieves the ID without loading the instance. And if that object is very large, and if there's a lot of properties or large strings or large collections or something, it'll be really expensive to load that just to get its ID. That would be really expensive. So this is a very lightweight way of getting the ID. And we can see that also. So if I run So in my domain classes, I have an author class, which just has a name, and then that book class, right? So these are defined as domain classes, so I can run this. So what I do is I create an author and save it, create another author and save it, and then I create a book. And because I'm not using has many, say, you know, add to books or anything like that. I just say new book, set the author, set the publish date, set the title, and save it. Very direct. And then because I don't know, because I didn't retain a reference to either of the author, I know I want the second one. So I can use the load method. I'll skip that, but that doesn't actually load it from the database. It just gets a proxy for it. So anyway, that doesn't matter. But so those first three calls just save two authors in a book. Then I clear the session, because I want to force this to reload from the database. So I use the with session message to flush out everything that's been saved, if it hasn't been flushed already, and clear the session. And then I can load the book. And my claim is that I can print the title and the publish date and the author ID, and I have SQL logging turned on, and I will not see a load to retrieve the author. But when I call printline b.author.id or b.author.name or any property in the author, then it's actually going to go to the database. So if you thought that author.id is an efficient way of getting it, you're wrong. Author ID, the dynamic property, is the way to go. So if I run this, what do we see? We've got the insert for the author, insert for an author, insert for the book. That's cool. Then we load the book, and we print. So where are we now? So we flushed and cleared. We loaded the book with get. And because I cleared the session, I had to go back to the database to get it. That's awesome. Now I can print B1 is the book title. The publish date is here. And the author ID is 2. So up till that point, I haven't loaded the author from the database. But then I print calling author.id. Then we can see the select for the author. So we can see that it actually does exactly what we wanted. It's a very lightweight way of getting the foreign key of the author object. And I'm pretty sure that that's not documented at all, which I'm sure is going to be a real shock to you guys that there's something missing or wrong in the Grails documentation. Very cool property. Did you guys know about that? Show of hands. Who has used that before? Yeah, not very many of you. So it's.
I have a question.
Yes.
I tried to use that, and I saw that sometimes used in unit tests.
No one in their right mind would ever use a unit test to test persistence. You're not claiming that you're using unit tests to test persistence.
Testing other stuff.
But there's no database.
Yeah.
So anything that you say is wrong or behaves strangely it's your fault. So when you convert those to integration tests, come back and we'll talk. Because unit tests, I mean, the GORM in unit tests is great, right? It's amazing. It's a technological feat. Seriously, I mean, it's super cool that there is a GORM, an in-memory GORM, that is 90 or so percent has 90% or so of the functionality of the real GORMs. But you know where we store the data in the in-memory GORM? It's a concurrent hash map. It's not a database. So there's no locking. There's no transactions. There's no tons of stuff. There's a bunch of weird edge case, and not even edge case, just weird things that just don't work or don't work the way you would expect them to. Because why would you have expected it to in the first place? It's just an in-memory thing. It's pretty cool, but it's really only, it's almost just an intellectual exercise. It's not something you're actually supposed to use. What you're supposed to use that for is when you're testing controllers and services, you use that in-memory GORM because you trust that your domain classes are properly tested using real GORM in integration and functional tests. But even then you get kind of stuck because sometimes you depend on locking and transactions and all that stuff in your unit tests for your controllers. And then it just doesn't work or it works strangely. But again, if you're testing anything like that, you should be using integration tests for those anyway. So test this. So you just create two tests for your controller. A unit test that tests the stuff that's safe to be unit tested, and then a controller integration test that does the other stuff that kind of needs an integration test. So, like I said, I'm going to be very opinionated today. I'm not sugarcoating anything. I'm telling you, this is the world according to Burt right now. So. Why would you ever do that? Please stop. If you do this, please stop. Save calls validate. So that calls validate twice. Validate's usually pretty inexpensive. But sometimes validate is not inexpensive. Sometimes validate creates a whole new session, goes to the database, loads a whole bunch of stuff. You can do whatever you want in a custom validator. You can make a web service call or a microservice call, or 500 microservice calls, or 10 million picoservice calls. So the cost of validate could be quite expensive. And it's something that you just decide. I mean, we decide that cost is worthwhile because we want good validation for these classes. But why would you call it twice? Because if that passes, if that's true, you just call it again. The fact that you called validate, it's not like save says nothing's happened between the last time we called validate and now. It doesn't have any logic like that. It says, I'm calling save, so I got to call validate first. If that succeeds, then I'm going to go to save. And then save returns null if there was a validation problem, or it returns the instance if there wasn't a validation problem. So just delete that, right? If save. If validation fails, it's going to return null. That's Groovy false. If validation succeeds, it returns this, which is Groovy true. And you do exactly what you wanted, but is anyone going to admit to using this? Stop. Okay. So primitive types in domain classes. This is kind of a cool thing. When you have an object type in a class and you create a new instance of that class, the object is the class field, not a parameter, not a variable inside of a method, but a field, right? Class scope field. When you create the instance of that object, if you don't initialize the object field to anything, it's initialized to null. And if it's a primitive type, like a number type or Boolean, then the numbers are initialized to 0 and Boolean is initialized to false. That causes a bunch of weird behaviors that, if that's fine, then that's fine, but I want to make sure that people kind of understand the implications of what's going on there. So if you don't know if you're going, so you create the instance and you send it, you populate your GSP, you create the form, fill out all that stuff, and then the user clicks submit, and then it gets sent back. You don't know if the user chose false, saw that you could do true or false, and chose false, or if they didn't even notice that it was there, or if you forgot to even put it in the UI, or 0, right? If your birth date, right? So you enter the year and the month and the day, and the year comes back 0. Well, that probably wasn't in your drop-down combo list, but in that case you could probably tell. But if 0 is a valid choice, you don't know if they chose it, or if they didn't know to do anything. So if you're using the non-primitive types, then it'll be null, and you know that there was no choice made. So there's a very big difference between null and 0, or null and false, right? Null is no value, false is a value, but they're not the same. So validation can be harder if you're using primitive types, but then there's something actually really weird that happens. So if the database column is nullable, which is valid, right? You can have a nullable column that takes numbers or Booleans, however your database stores Booleans. Your database may have native support for it, or it may use a 0 or a 1 or something, whatever it does, but there are very valid use cases for having database columns that store Booleans and numbers that are nullable. But you can't store null in a primitive type. Null and 0 are not the same. Null and false are not the same. You may consider them the same for your business rules, but that you can't. No framework could ever assume that 0 is an acceptable conversion from null. And Grails doesn't do it, and Hibernate doesn't do it. But Hibernate does something very weird. So if I want the type to be nullable, Hibernate says you're going to get null pointer exceptions, because if I store null in the row and then I try to instantiate that object, it's going to try to set null in a primitive type, and it's going to fail. So it's going to convert your. If you run Schema Export, let me run that real quick while this is going. So I'm going to run Grails. Schema Export, which is a really cool script that, yeah, you probably can't read that, but it's going to create a SQL.ddl file in the target directory, which has all the table definitions that Hibernate would have run if you were using create drop. So it's going to have all the create table statements. So let me open that up in an editor. So forget about the drops, and we don't care about those, but it's the. So I've got a primitive class over here. It just has two numbers and a Boolean, and I made them all nullable true, right? Because the default is nullable false. So I'm forcing all to be nullable. But then when I look at the actual table that Hibernate's going to create, it's creating not null columns, which is great because I've got primitive types in my domain classes. Now it's not going to allow nulls, so it saved me from null pointer exceptions. But it also lied to me because I said I want it nullable, and it said nope, you don't. But it doesn't tell you that. There's no warnings. There's no it magically fixes this problem for you. But then you've got this disconnect between what you think is in the database and what's really in the database. And it's good and bad. I mean, it's nice that they do that, but it's kind of weird. I mean, I would hope that it would be an error or at least log a warning or something. So the long and short of it is not nullable primitives, non-nullable primitives. Do whatever makes sense for your application, but use the wrapper classes. So capital I integer, capital L long, capital B Boolean. Use those for those cases where you need to know if a value was actually chosen or if you need nullable number types. Because now, if there's a null in that column for the integer, now I can store that in that type. And I know that there's no value. And then for some other row, there's a 0, and that's different. For this row, I have a null Boolean, and for this one, I have a false Boolean. Those are different, and it's all valid. But now it's doing what I told it to do. Find by ID versus get. Don't look at the stuff. Is there a difference between find by ID and get?
Yes.
They're basically the same, right? Get finds by ID, right? They both give you the one instance if it's there, or null if it's not. But find by ID is a dynamic finder. It's just like find by name or find by gender and age or find by whatever and whatever and whatever. It's just, there's nothing special about find by ID. It's just that the ID property is named ID. So, but it's a dynamic finder. So we can, Hibernate will cache get, call, or return values very aggressively, very well. But it'll, I don't think I'm plugged in. That's fine. Click that link. Hibernate query cache considered harmful. It's a really great explanation for why you want to be really careful when you're using the query cache in Hibernate. Because Hibernate will, basically the long and short of it is, if you use a query cache and you have cached query results for, say, the person class, doesn't matter what the class name is, and then I add in one person, or I delete one person, or I edit one person. If I do anything at all to a person, Hibernate is going to look at all the previous cached query results, and it's going to clear them all out. Because it doesn't know that the new instance that you created would have been part of the results of that previous query. It doesn't know that the changed one is in there. It doesn't know that the deleted one is there. So because it just tries to do the right thing, it's paranoid, and it just clears out all those results. So if you have a class that you're adding a lot of instances in, or deleting a lot of instances, or editing, you're going to get a lot of thrashing. So you're going to run the query, cache it, run another query, empty it out. Run the query, cache it, run another query, throw it out. So you're basically going to be going to the database every time anyway. And it'll actually be it'll be more expensive to cache it than to go direct every time, because you're wasting all that time storing the stuff in the cache. And if it's a distributed cache, if you're running a cluster and you've got several Grails instances, and you're distributing the cache in memory, it's going to serialize all that stuff across the wire to all your other instances, and then throw it all away. Send it to all the instances and throw it all away. So find by ID is cached that way. Get is cached much better, because if I create a new person, Hibernate knows that has no bearing on the previously cached person instances. There's no overlap. It knows that. If I delete an instance, it knows whether it was one of the ones that was cached or not. If I edit ones, so it can really aggressively not cache or not clear the cache for gets. So never use find by ID, except for if you combine it with some other property for some reason. But I can't think of any reason. Can you guys think of a reason to ever use find by ID versus get? I can't come up with an example of why you would ever do that unless you are trying to sabotage your application performance. which if that's your thing, go for it. All right, I'm going to go through this really quickly, but there was a really interesting discussion on Twitter. Craig Burke created this Groovy document builder. Kind of a cool project. But what was interesting about it wasn't the project, which is cool, but it uses iText. And iText has this weird licensing thing where up until several versions ago, it was free, and now you got to pay for it. And so a lot of times we cheat and we use the old version, the last one before the license changed. But Bruno Logi, the guy who wrote the library, hates that because he wants you to pay him, which is fine because we shouldn't be stealing from each other. We should be paying for what we use from other developers. But what shocked me was, when I read through all this discussion, if you use GPL, it's completely, you can't use GPL and ASL2 together. I don't know much about licenses. I'm not a lawyer and all that, but I had no idea. And if you click through these links, and it's so weird, because even GPL3, which is kind of the friendly one, the one that isn't evil, and isn't quite so viral, they have this phrase in there that says we don't even use GPL3 because they say that even linking to a GPL3 project is basically a derivative work, which is crazy, but they wrote the license so they get to say that. So if you're using Apache licenses, you cannot use a single GPL jar file. Did anybody know that? This is crazy. Of course, why would you ever? Because GPL sucks. And everything that's cool in the world is Apache licensed. Don't do that. I just thought this was fascinating. So I'm not going to talk about this much. There's a lot of links there. I strongly suggest you click through those and read that because it's fascinating stuff. Terrifying, really, but fascinating. All right, so Log4j. I love Log4j, but you want to be using SLF4j or Commons logging, I suppose, but use a wrapper library so that the underlying implementation can be switched out. So by default, we use Log4j, but you can use Logback or Log4j2 or other supported implementations. And for example, in Boot and in Spring and in Grails 3, we use Logback because it's much more modern. They fixed a lot of the problems, the blocking issues, performance issues in Log4j. But the signatures are different. So in Log4j, the signature for debug or info or whatever takes an object. And that's great for what we do in Groovy and what we do in Grails for a reason I will point out in a bit. So SLF4j, though, it takes a string. You're logging strings anyway, so why is that bad? Well, we'll see. So it turns out that SLF4j takes strings, Log4j 1.2 and 2, and Commons logging all take object, and Logback also takes string. So Logback and SLF4j have a string. So if I say log.debug, the huge collection of things is this, right? And pretend that things is a list of 5,000 items. So logging that would create this gigantic string. But if it turns out that the log level is at info or error or something, then this isn't going to get logged. But so if I'm using one of the libraries that has an object type, then it's just going to pass the whole unrealized G-string, and it's going to throw it away. There's no cost to that because G-string is very lightweight, and it doesn't actually convert it into, it doesn't actually stringify that until you need to. But Groovy will convert the G-string to a string if the signature takes a string. So what's going to happen is, if you're using SLF4j, it will take that collection, append it to that string, send it down to the logging method, then it's going to say, nope, we don't do debug. It's going to throw it away. So you're incurring the huge cost, potentially large cost, of creating this gigantic non-loggable string and then throwing it away. So don't do that. The API is pretty cool, though, so this is the way you'd want to do that. They have placeholder support. And you can use as many as you like. And so so this is just as lightweight as the G-string example. Probably a little bit lighter weight because there is a small cost to actually creating the G-string object. And then if we're not logging at the debug level, then we pass the string and the collection down to the logging API, and then it throws that away, so there's no cost there. Because you want your debugging to be lightweight. And if you're in debug mode, then you incur that cost. But if you're in production, you want your log debug statements to not print. But they won't print, they won't show up in the log files, but you get this weird performance hit because of all that logging is actually costing you, but you don't know it. So it's a very hidden, probably subtle, defined bug. You got a question?
There are these annotations. I know that there is one for J. I don't know if there is one that's for J.
Actually, the annotations are, am I running over? The annotations are great, because you know what the annotations do? They do if log debug is enabled. So that's what you really want to do. Use the annotations. And the code that gets wired in through the AST actually wraps all the calls in an if log, if you say log.info, it'll say if log.info is enabled. And so all the stuff inside of the if doesn't run if you're not using it. But that's different because if you use the annotation, it does that. But if you use just static log equals logger dot whatever, then they're going to perform very, very differently.
How does that behave with the injected log property from Grails? If you use the annotation, is that going to overwrite it?
Yes. The Grails ASTs always, if there's something already there, it just doesn't do anything. So yeah, you want to get in the habit of using the @SLF for J. I'll do this real quick. If you say static final string foo equals foo, I always leave public off because public is the default scope. Or public static. The first one, every time you define a property in a class in Groovy, it creates the getters and setters. And if it's final, it doesn't create the setter. But you're actually going to get a getFoo method. Not a big deal, but it's probably not what you're expecting. So the one time I ever use public in Groovy classes is for this sort of a thing. Because if you decompile that class, you'll see that you actually get a getFoo method, which is not really what you wanted. That really surprised me. I thought that was pretty cool. Ken Cousin mentioned that a couple years ago at a conference, and I just want to see how far I got to go, because I'm running out of time. Okay, real quick. Transient methods, or the methods to be added to transient. So, quiz, do I need to put the click count property in the transients list here? I've got a getter, right? So I need to add it, right? Pretend, yeah. You're lying. Half of you think you do. I want to see your code, because I know you do this. What if it's a setter? Do I need it then? Come on, you people are still lying. What if I have a getter and a setter? Now do I need it? Now I know you're lying because you don't even know what I'm talking about. What's worse, lying or ignorance? I don't know. It turns out in this case I do need it. Why is that? When I say, so pretend that this isn't here. So it's just string name, right? So Groovy, you know what happens with that, right? There's no type, there's no scope modifier. So the Groovy compiler will turn that into a private field of private string name, and it'll create a public get name and a public set name, always. And if you have your own methods, it won't create them, it won't overwrite yours. And that's what Hibernate sees. It doesn't see string name. Hibernate doesn't know anything about Groovy. Hibernate sees the get name and set name, sees that as a property defining method pair, and that's what defines a property as far as Java Beans and as far as Hibernate's concerned. So if I create a getter or setter, it's not a pair, it's not a property. But as soon as I got a pair, that's a property. That's going to become persistent. And if I run Schema Export on this, it's going to create a column called click count of type int, which is probably not what you wanted. So now I have to add it to the list. But don't bother if you only have a getter or a setter. All right, I'm going to talk about this, but I'm not going to talk in detail. Did you know, I don't think you do, that if you want to create custom templates for your controllers, domain classes, whatever, you run Grails install templates, right? We all know that. But what about build config and config.groovy, datasource.groovy, all that stuff? Is there a way to customize those? Or do I have to edit them every single time I run Grails create app? Believe me, I've created 1,000 Grails applications, and I've edited them by hand a lot. I got sick of it, so around the time that we did Grails 2.3, I created a mechanism for creating your own templates and putting them in a special place and using those instead. So read the stuff, and you'll see the links, and you can see how that works. Actually, I answered a question on Stack Overflow because I never ended up putting that in the documentation. So it's yet another undocumented feature of Grails. And then I'm gonna have to leave the exception discussion as homework. But be really careful about exceptions. And don't ever use fail on error true. Right? How many people use fail on error true? A lot. Get out of here, you're all fired. It's crazy. Have you guys seen Groovy stack traces? Have you seen how big they are if they're not filtered? They're like 7,000 lines long, right? 10,000, 15,000, I don't know, who counts? They're not that big, but they're stupidly large, right? Because you got all those extra stack frames from all that dynamic code, right? Hundreds and hundreds of lines of that's expensive to create, to populate all that stuff. And if you are throwing exceptions for non-exceptional cases like I typed the wrong password, I'm a human being, I make mistakes. Or I'm a hacker, but that's not exceptional. It's expected. People make mistakes. So we have validation to check that stuff. So look at this. You use fail and error true because you want to be robust, right? So this is your code. Create a new thing, save it, fail and error true. If it throws an exception, oh no, handle the problem. If it doesn't throw an exception, then we're in here and we're good, right? So that's your great robust code, right? This is my code. Doesn't look very different, does it? Yours is stupidly expensive. Mine is pretty awesome. Because look what I'm doing. I create the thing, I save it, I say it has errors. It's the same frickin' code. If it has errors, I handle the errors. It's in the opposite order. It's the same code. This isn't like hand waving and stuff. This is literal code that you would use. There's never a reason to use fail and error true unless you have you know the Munchausen's proxy syndrome? It's where you make other people, like you make your children sick so that they need you. You poison them. So we're poisoning our applications so that we can fix them. That's sick. It's demented. Stop doing that. Stop breaking, sabotaging performance of our Groovy-based Grails applications. It's not good job security. It's just sad. So I've got a couple of ways to do this and some great links. Please, please, please click those links and read those articles. That's real data. And the thing you want to keep in mind is that those guys are talking about Java exceptions. All those performance numbers, multiply them by some very large multiplier for Groovy, because it's going to be that much more expensive in Groovy. Don't do dumb exception stuff. Don't intentionally create exceptions in Groovy-based applications, ever, unless you have to. Use exceptions for exceptional cases. Buy this book. All right, thank you. We have a couple minutes before the next talk if you guys have any questions, or we can talk after if you want. All right, so I'll be putting the code out on GitHub and the slides up on SlideShare, and I'll tweet that out later. And I'll probably do a blog post for this one too. So this will all be available very soon.